Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Banks and I'm 68 years old. I've heard countless stories in my life, but one has always stayed with me. The story we were told as children about a strange little man spinning straw into gold and a name that could end everything. At the time, it felt like a simple fairy tale, a cautionary story meant to entertain. But as I grew older, I began to notice something that didn't make sense. Why did knowing a name suddenly hold so much power? Why did the story end the moment it was spoken? Rumpelstiltskin. Now, this is what has been hidden from us. This story is not just a children's tale, it carries centuries of meaning, lessons about survival, about secret power, about bargains made under impossible pressure. The little man, Rumpelstiltskin, is more than a character. He is a symbol of how power works when identity is hidden, and how fragile that power becomes when it is revealed. And that's when the story truly begins. Listen to Ben.
You have heard from Sarah. Now, let me explain. It was the early 19th century, 1812, in what we now call the German states, a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, and shifting borders. Two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, were collecting stories, not simply to entertain children, but to preserve the memory of a culture that seemed to be slipping away. Language, tradition, identity, all of it was fragile, and they believed these tales held it together. Among the many stories they gathered was one called Rumpelstiltskin, and in their version, it begins with desperation. A miller, hoping to impress the king, claims that his daughter can spin straw into gold. It's a lie, of course, but once spoken, it cannot be taken back. The king, a figure of authority and wealth, locks the girl in a room overflowing with straw. He gives her an impossible ultimatum: turn it into gold by morning or face punishment. She weeps, not because of magic, but because of the pressure, the weight of expectation, the fear of failure, social, economic, and absolute. And then quietly he appears, the small, unfamiliar man. He doesn't arrive with fireworks or thunder, only with a proposition. He will spin the straw into gold, but there is a price. First a necklace, then a ring, and finally, when she has nothing left, a promise, her firstborn child. The agreement is spoken, made under duress, sealed in silence. No witnesses, no paper, only words heavy with consequence. Years pass. The miller's daughter becomes a queen. The bargain, however, lingers. The strange man returns, reminding her of what she owes. But he gives her a chance. If she can discover his name within 3 days, the debt will be undone. She searches desperately. Messengers ride across forests and villages. And on the last night, by what feels like sheer luck, she overhears him alone, celebrating in the woods. The name slips from his lips, Rumpelstiltskin. And with that, the bargain collapses. His power evaporates, his claim disappears. His place in the story is gone. That's where most fairy tales end. But the Grimms were careful men. They repeatedly noted in their letters and manuscripts that they were not the authors. They were collectors, editors, preservers of stories that had existed long before their pens touched paper. Tales told by villagers, written in manuscripts, passed from one generation to the next. Some of these stories were already centuries old, which means the 1812 publication was not the beginning of Rumpelstiltskin. It was simply the moment the story was frozen in ink, a snapshot of a tale that had already been shaped, reshaped, and whispered through generations who may never have called him Rumpelstiltskin at all. Before the brothers Grimm ever wrote anything down in 1812, this story was already alive, quietly, persistently, across German-speaking Europe. I remember reading about it later, but when I think back, I can almost hear the voices in the kitchens of Swabia and Bavaria, in the alpine valleys of Austria and Switzerland, centuries before ink or paper ever captured a word. Families huddled by the fire in winter, telling tales again and again. There was no official version, only patterns that returned, slightly changed, from one generation to the next. And the core of the story was always the same. A task is demanded that no human effort could ever complete. The demand comes from authority, a lord, a king, sometimes even an employer. And the one who must meet it is almost always vulnerable. A young woman, a servant, a peasant's child. The work itself changes from place to place. Sometimes it's spinning straw, sometimes weaving or milling. Sometimes it's transforming the worthless into something valuable. But the pressure is constant. Failure is not just disappointment, it carries real consequences, threats to survival, to freedom, even to family itself. And then just when hope seems gone, help appears. But here's the part that surprised me as I studied these old tales. In these earliest versions, the helper doesn't have a name. Not yet. He is small, sometimes oddly dressed, sometimes simply unfamiliar. He appears without warning, knows exactly what to do, and asks for a price that seems fair at first, maybe a necklace, a ring, a promise of the future, until it grows too great to reclaim. These helpers appear all over Europe under many names, or no name at all. Folklorists would later classify them in the Arne Thompson Uther Index, grouping them among tales of supernatural, or seemingly supernatural, helpers and impossible bargains. But what struck me most is how they were portrayed. They were not always cruel, they were not always tricksters, and they were not always defeated. In some Alpine versions, the helper is closer to a household spirit, resentful if mistreated, generous if respected. In others, he enforces the bargain without malice, as though he is simply following a rule older than himself. The danger is not in his presence, it is in the bargain itself. And the most unsettling part? In many early versions, there is no dramatic revelation of a name, no sudden triumph, no humiliation, no destruction. The story does not end in victory, which makes me wonder if these early helpers were not always malevolent, if they were not always tricksters, then the story we know, the one the Grimms recorded, is something different. It's not just a tale about a clever girl or a greedy little man. It's a story transformed, shaped by changing ideas of power, labor, and obligation. And that transformation had already begun long before the Grimms ever heard the name Rumpelstiltskin spoken aloud. To understand why this story took the shape it did, we have to step back into the world that shaped it. Between 1000 and 1400 CE, much of Europe operated under a feudal system defined by obligation, scarcity, and hierarchy. Wealth was concentrated at the top, while survival for most depended on labor that was constant, physical, and often invisible. In this world, spinning was not a pastime or a symbol of domestic calm. It was work, essential, time-consuming, and relentless. Textiles were among the most valuable commodities of medieval Europe. Cloth functioned as clothing, currency, inheritance, and trade. A household's ability to spin wool or flax could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. For many families, particularly in rural regions of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, spinning was work done primarily by women, often from childhood onward. This matters because folklore does not invent labor at random. It reflects what people know. In this context, the image of a young woman ordered to spin vast quantities of material overnight is not fantasy. It is an exaggeration of a very real demand. The impossibility of the task mirrors the lived experience of people expected to meet quotas, rents, and obligations that exceeded human capacity. Gold in these stories is rarely just gold. In medieval Europe, gold represents debt, owed to landlords, lords, or kings. It represents taxation imposed from above, often with little regard for the realities below. And it represents pressure, the kind that builds slowly, silently, until failure becomes inevitable. When the miller's daughter is locked in a room and told to produce wealth she cannot create, the story is not about transformation through magic. It is about what happens when labor is extracted beyond its limits. The deal that follows reflects this reality. The helper does not create wealth freely. He demands compensation, and each payment escalates, mirroring the way real obligations compound over time. What begins as a manageable cost becomes a future loss, something not yet possessed but already claimed. This pattern appears repeatedly in medieval moral tales. Agreements made under pressure are not neutral. They bind the vulnerable more tightly than the powerful, and once spoken, they are difficult to escape, not because of enchantment, but because of social expectation. Importantly, in many early versions, the helper does not force the bargain, he offers it. The choice, however constrained, still belongs to the one who accepts. This detail shifts the story away from supernatural punishment and toward social commentary. The danger is not the figure who spins the straw. The danger is a system in which survival itself requires impossible promises. And when viewed this way, the story of Rumpelstiltskin stops being a fairy tale about cleverness and becomes something quieter and more unsettling. A reflection of how ordinary people navigated power, debt, and labor in a world where refusal was rarely an option. Yet this way of telling the story, using labor and wealth as metaphor, did not begin in medieval Europe. Versions of the same pattern appear again, centuries earlier, in places far removed from spinning wheels and feudal kings. And that raises a question historians still tread carefully around. If this theme predates the Middle Ages, then where did it begin? As historians trace the structure of this story further back, the trail does not end in medieval Europe. It widens. By around 2000 BCE, in the regions historians now call the ancient Near East, particularly Mesopotamia and Anatolia, written records begin to preserve ideas that feel strikingly familiar. These societies centered around cities like Ur, Uruk, and Hattusa, left behind clay tablets rather than fairy tales. But embedded in their myths, legal codes, and ritual texts is a recurring logic that echoes the structure of the Rumpelstiltskin story. These early cultures placed extraordinary importance on secret knowledge. Knowledge was not merely information, it was authority. To know the correct ritual, the proper words, or the hidden name of a force was to gain leverage over it. This idea appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature, where power is often mediated through intermediaries, messengers, servants of the gods, or figures who operate between worlds, human and divine, labor and reward. In myths such as those preserved in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, outcomes are rarely achieved through force alone. They are negotiated, bargains are struck, terms are agreed upon under pressure, and crucially, the balance of power depends on what is known and what is concealed. Names in particular carried weight. In these cultures, a name was not simply a label. It represented essence, role, and function within the cosmic order. To know a true name was to recognize a being's place in the hierarchy of existence. This belief does not appear as a single story, but as a pattern repeated across religious hymns, incantations, and legal traditions. There are no spinning wheels here, no straw, no gold rooms guarded by kings, but the structure remains, an impossible demand, a figure who enables its fulfillment, a transaction made under constraint, and an imbalance corrected not through strength, but through revelation. Scholars are careful at this point, and rightly so. There is no evidence of a direct line connecting Mesopotamian myth to medieval German folklore. No tablet mentions a figure resembling Rumpelstiltskin by name or description. What exists instead is something subtler and in some ways more compelling, a shared cultural logic. Across time and geography, human societies appear to return to the same questions. What happens when survival depends on agreements we cannot fully control? Who holds power in a bargain, and how can that power be undone? The recurrence of these themes suggests not inheritance, but convergence. Different cultures facing different pressures arrived at similar narrative solutions. Stories became a way to explore systems that felt overwhelming and opaque. As folklorists often note, this is not proof of origin, but it does show continuity in human storytelling. And within that continuity, one detail refuses to disappear. Across centuries, languages, and belief systems, the idea persists that knowing a true name changes everything, which brings us back to the moment the story ends. Not with force or escape, but with a word spoken aloud. By the Bronze Age, the idea that a name carried power was no longer implicit. It was explicit, structured, and carefully preserved. In ancient Egypt, surviving texts from the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 to 1700 BCE, described names as inseparable from identity. To record a name was to preserve a person's place in the world. To erase it was to diminish their existence. Egyptian naming rituals were deliberate acts, often tied to lineage, profession, and divine order. Individuals could possess more than one name, a public name used in daily life, and a deeper protected name known only within restricted circles. This distinction mattered because knowledge conferred authority. Priests, scribes, and officials were trained not simply to read and write, but to guard specific words, titles, and formulas. Access to names, especially divine or ceremonial ones, was limited. Secrecy functioned as protection, not mystery. It preserved hierarchy. A similar pattern appears in Hebrew texts, particularly those compiled between 1200 and 500 BCE. Names signify role, covenant, and responsibility. They are given, changed, and withheld at moments of transition. In these traditions, to know a name is to understand a being's nature and obligations within a moral framework. But even here, boundaries remain. Certain names are spoken publicly, others are avoided, abbreviated, or replaced with titles out of reverence or caution. Moving into classical Greece and Rome, from roughly 800 BCE to 300 CE, the distinction becomes social as well as religious. Individuals are known by formal names, family names, and honorifics, each revealing a different layer of identity. Philosophers such as Plato and later commentators debated whether names reflected inherent truth or were conventions imposed by society. Yet even as theory evolved, practice remained conservative. Names carried legal weight. They established citizenship, inheritance, and accountability. Across these cultures, one principle remains consistent. A name defines where someone stands in relation to power. This is why secrecy matters. To conceal a name is to delay accountability. To reveal it is to fix identity in place, making it visible to authority and judgment. The separation between a public name and a true name is not superstition. It is a reflection of how societies manage responsibility. Seen through this lens, the ending of the Rumpelstiltskin story begins to shift in meaning. The helper's name is not hidden because it is magical. It is hidden because once spoken, it situates him within the social order. It removes ambiguity. It transforms him from an anonymous force into a defined figure, one who can be judged, dismissed, or bound by rules that anonymity once allowed him to avoid. These beliefs reflect social structures, not literal supernatural claims. They describe how power operates when identity is known or concealed, and that understanding leads to a quiet but unsettling question. If names exist to assign responsibility, then why does Rumpelstiltskin work so carefully to hide his at all? By the late Middle Ages, roughly 1300 to 1600 CE, something subtle but important begins to change in the way this story is told across Central and Western Europe. Earlier versions had treated the helper as ambiguous, sometimes useful, sometimes dangerous, but rarely central. Now he begins to shrink, not only in stature, but in social presence. He is no longer part of the household or the community. He arrives alone, he leaves alone, and he keeps himself deliberately apart. In regions such as southern Germany, Austria, and the Alpine borderlands, storytellers increasingly describe him as secretive and transactional. His role narrows. He does not assist out of obligation or custom. He negotiates. Every action has a price, and that price is fixed before the work begins. This shift reflects a broader change in European society. As oral folklore gradually gives way to written collections and moral instruction, stories begin to emphasize consequences. Agreements are no longer neutral exchanges shaped by circumstance. They become warnings. The helper's anonymity, once practical, becomes suspicious. His secrecy, once protective, becomes evidence of guilt. By the early modern period, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, the tone hardens. The story begins to focus less on survival and more on accountability. The helper is increasingly framed as someone who must be exposed. His power lies not in what he does, but in what he hides. And when his name is finally revealed, it is no longer just a clever solution. It is a form of punishment. Exposure becomes the mechanism through which order is restored. The community reasserts control by stripping the figure of anonymity. The story is no longer asking how people endure impossible demands. It is asking who is allowed to operate outside the rules, and what happens when they are forced back inside them. The helper's role contracts as the moral expands, and in that transition, the story becomes less about help and more about control. By the early 1800s, in a Germany still fragmented into kingdoms and principalities, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were doing more than collecting stories. They were shaping them. Working in places like Kassel and later Göttingen, the brothers believed folklore could help define a shared cultural identity. Germany as a nation did not yet exist. Language and tradition became substitutes for borders. And so, when the Grimms edited tales like Rumpelstiltskin, their choices were deliberate. They sought moral clarity. Ambiguity was reduced. Characters were given clearer roles: innocent, guilty, punished, redeemed. The helper, once a shifting figure shaped by circumstance, becomes a fixed cautionary presence. His secrecy is no longer practical, it is suspect. His bargain is no longer contextual, it is deceptive. Christian ethical framing also plays a role. Promises made in desperation are dangerous. Greed invites consequence. Hidden dealings lead to ruin. The story now warns as much as it entertains. In this version, Rumpelstiltskin is no longer a marginal helper navigating survival alongside others. He is an outsider whose power depends on concealment, and once that concealment fails, he cannot remain in the story. The name becomes a verdict. By speaking it, the queen does not merely escape a contract, she exposes a figure who operates beyond social and moral accountability. The tale resolves by restoring order, reaffirming boundaries, and punishing deception. And yet, even in this carefully shaped ending, something remains unresolved. The Grimms tell us that the name ends his power. They never explain why. The destruction feels absolute, but the reason remains just out of reach, as though the story itself is withholding one final answer. By the time the story reaches its final form, the warning it carries is no longer hidden in symbolism, it is quietly embedded in structure. Across centuries, from medieval Europe to the Grimm version published in 1812, one idea remains consistent: power without identity is unstable. The helper's strength does not come from force or magic, but from anonymity. As long as he has no name, he exists outside accountability. He can make demands, enforce bargains, and disappear without consequence. Once the name is spoken, that protection collapses. In social terms familiar to the early 19th century audience, a named individual could be judged, recorded, punished, or excluded. Identity made authority visible. It placed power within reach of the community and the law. Rumpelstiltskin's defeat reflects that logic. His loss is not physical, it is administrative, social, and absolute. The story also cautions against agreements made under pressure. The Queen's bargain is not portrayed as evil, but as dangerous. Desperation narrows choices. Promises offered in moments of fear carry costs that only become clear later. This theme would have resonated deeply in societies shaped by debt, labor obligations, and inherited contracts. What makes the tale endure is that it does not blame a single character. The king's demand, the miller's lie, the helper's secrecy, all contribute to the outcome. Responsibility is shared, but consequences are uneven. In the end, the story suggests that systems allowing anonymous power will eventually correct themselves, sometimes harshly. Exposure restores balance, but not without loss. This is why the story survives, not because of its strangeness or its spectacle, but because its warning is timeless. As we reach the end of this journey, we return to the question we began with: why does knowing a name end the story? Through centuries of folklore, labor myths, and cultural evolution, the answer slowly comes into focus. Names define us, anchor us in society, and determine the reach of our power. To conceal a name is to hold authority in the shadows. To reveal it is to restore balance, to enforce accountability, and to remind us that every secret carries its own cost. Rumpelstiltskin was never just a character. He was a reminder that power without identity is fragile, and that every secret eventually demands a name. If this story captivated your curiosity, imagine what other hidden histories await. Subscribe now, join the journey into the shadows of folklore, and hit like and share to bring these timeless tales to those who love stories that linger long after the page is closed. Every click helps uncover the next secret,